All right. Welcome to another episode of Streaming Clouds. And as always, thank you for tuning in. My name is Robin. In case you don't know, I'm a cloud solution architect at NordCloud. And I'm happy to be here on this live stream again.
So, I'm Kevin Evans, and I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft as well. This is our last episode for the year, and we've got a special guest on, right? So we haven't really touched cybersecurity this year on some of our shows, and it's not because we're not a fan of it. You know, I have worn cybersecurity hats in the past. It's just that it's such a massive subject, right? And with the whole cloud piece, as we look into that as well, that gets really deep quickly, right, for our viewers. So me and Robin have been trying to think of ways to how do we break this in, right? How do we start off doing some cybersecurity episodes, right, or focused on cybersecurity? And I heard about Jeff Mann in particular, right, who's our guest on our show, and Jeff's story is quite incredible, right, from where he started from, where he went in working in the NSA, and then how he transitioned from basically working from the NSA to the private sector to the stuff that he does now. So I'm going to hand over to Jeff, just give ourselves a quick introduction about himself, and then we'll proceed with the show.
Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me on today. And I didn't realize I was your guinea pig for talking cybersecurity for your whole show. Thanks for that. I'll try to live up to expectations. It's hard for me to give a brief introduction of my background because I've been in what now is known as cybersecurity industry for about 40 years, business for about 40 years. I start the clock back when I was in college. Actually, I worked for a state agency doing loan skip tracing. The state was trying to get people not to default on student loans because then they'd have to pay them off. So I was learning, looking back on it now, I wouldn't have called it that at the time, but looking back on it, I was learning social engineering skills and investigative skills, trying to find people that were sometimes more, sometimes not, trying not to be found. So a little bit of forensics, a little bit of investigation, a little bit of we were allowed to lie within limits, but we could call somebody's grandparent and say, "Hey, I'm looking for Bobby. I used to, hang out with him at Jones University." Which is where he allegedly went to school and why he took out the student loan type of thing. And grandmothers were great because like, "Oh, Bobby," if that's the name I use. Let me go get his number for you. So, but that was college. I graduated college. Actually was working for a DoD agency. I was working for the U.S. Navy for a little while until I, found my career. And somewhere along the line, turned in an application to work at the National Security Agency, and they hired me. And I was there for about 10 years, from 86 to 96. And so that was encompassing sort of the beginning of the internet being a thing and World Wide Web, we called it back then, browsing. The internet existed, but it was mostly between government agencies and universities. And the movie War Games goes all the way back to 1983. So it was it had been around since the 70s, but publicly available, publicly accessible really wasn't until the early 90s, where coincidentally I was in an office where we started looking into how do you protect the security of your network and how do you protect your internet connection and your systems by breaking into them. So we came to be known as the first NSA Red Team. And we operated out of an office that we nicknamed the Pit. And because we were just trying to be cool and geeky and kind of live the hacker culture as best we could, because we were government employees and also geeks. But somewhere along the line, the Pit somehow took hold and is part of the NSA folklore. To the point where it's been several years now, but there was a book published back in the mid, I think it was in 2015, that talked about the history of the U.S. secret cyber war. And in that book, in one of the chapters, it talks about the NSA Red Team operating out of a super secret chamber called the Pit. And when one of my former coworkers, a member of the Pit, got the book and read it, he got in touch with all of us. It's like, guys, we're famous. We're in a book. We're in a book. So that's part of the folklore and the pedigree that I bring to the table. But I went out in the private sector. I've been in the private sector for 26 years. And initially it was working with clients, trying to teach them how to do security if they were going to plug into the internet and try to do any kind of commerce, either e-commerce or just using the internet as a backbone or communication method or whatever. People were looking for ideas back then of how to use the internet to improve their businesses. And I was working at an organization, and a lot of organizations popped up trying to teach companies how to do security right. Because I came out of an organization who lived and breathed. In fact, our title was information security. Somewhere along the line, it became known as cybersecurity, and I kind of hate the term because I find it to be kind of nebulous, and I have a hard time. That's why I'm chuckling that you're like having me represent it, because I don't even like the term. So thanks for that. But as an example, I at some point decided, well, I think cybersecurity is kind of more government DoD centric, but then I was talking to some government DoD centric type people, and they're like, oh no, it comes from the private sector. It's like, who knows? So my question to you guys is, not to put you on the spot, but when you say cybersecurity, I'm not looking for an exact answer, and nobody's going to hold you to it. But what do you think of when you think cybersecurity? And especially for this segment where we're supposed to be talking about how to maybe be interested or build a career in cybersecurity, what do you think that means? And there is no right or wrong answer. I'm just kind of curious as to where you're going, and I can help us down that road.
I mean, for me, I can give my black and white take on it, right? If folks are interested in that. I mean, I started to have like you said, an information security career, right? I think that's probably more legitimate, right? And
Right.
it was recruiters that introduced me to the name cybersecurity, because folks didn't really take cybersecurity seriously, right?
Right.
In organizations, there was no
Didn't?
CISOs at the time. Like, you know what I mean, right? It was like
Still
you
don't.
had somebody, yeah, right. You're still trying to get the CISO to get the answer yes, right, from the board. But
Right.
for me, it was more like you would have somebody who was interested in security working on a technical team, right? Who had that background in trying to keep the bad guys out, right? Kind of thing. So for me, that's how I got introduced into the term cybersecurity, because it was like that industry or that career path had like a relaunch. It was like, how do we relaunch this, right, to get people interested in it, right? And that's recruiters started reaching out to me and going, hey, do you want to have a role in cybersecurity? And I'll be like, yeah, but which bit, right? So do you want me to be an infosec manager? Do you want me to be a governance person? Or do you want me to manage the firewalls, right, and the perimeter? Which section of it is, right? So it's like a overarching term, I would say, Jeff,
we're more or less on the same page in terms of it's a very much nebulous sort of umbrella term that there's that whole COVID shutdown thing, but in the past year, trade shows and conferences are starting to come back, and people are actually starting to attend them again. So you think about walking a vendor trade room floor or something like that. Like you said, cyber is kind of a catch-all term, trying to pull them in. I think, like most terminology in this industry, and we may not be unique in this context, but a lot of our terminology actually comes from the sales and marketing department, for better or for worse. And but if you think I think about going to a trade show, the big ones like RSA in San Francisco or Black Hat in Vegas. The more ones where the suits and the managers go, not the hacker conferences like DEF CON that is on the other end of town in Vegas. But when I think of a role in cybersecurity, I'm like, well, there's all the people at the booth, the sales and marketing. They claim to be working in cybersecurity, but I don't think that's what most people are talking about. There's possibly developers, engineers, administrators, but I'm not sure that's what people are talking about either. So, I think that a lot of people, when they're talking about, like the shortage of careers in cybersecurity, it might be a little bit of, there's a need everywhere, but I think most people are talking about, and it's what I would sort of call the nuts and bolts of security at the end of the day, is the ability to, um, and to be looking at your network, looking at your systems, looking at your operations, and do some sort of monitoring and detection, and then ultimately response. And of course, those words might sound familiar because they're parts of frameworks from such governing bodies like NIST and CIS. Stuff that we were figuring out 30 years ago, kind of on the fly, but also coming from a discipline where back before the internet. Data was on paper mostly, and kept in very safe places, like locked rooms and locked buildings with fences and armed guards and things like that. And really, in the time when I was coming to work at NSA, what NSA was about then, I can't speak for today, but on what most people know about NSA and what people think about NSA, they're intercepting communications that are being pulled out of mostly the air back then. Wasn't even so much telecommunications back then. It was radio, various frequencies of radio, and our enemy back then was mostly the Soviet Union. This was during the Cold War, and lots of investment was put into trying to hide the signal. Either frequency, different high-low frequencies, slowing down the signal, speeding up the signal, frequency hopping. It was all signals intelligence, and the side of NSA that I worked on was for the most of my time there was sort of the defense, the protecting U.S. communications, U.S. armed forces, and U.S. interests. So we were building crypto systems that were designed to enable these types of communications, which were again primarily radio signals going out, and do it in a encrypted, protected manner, so that if it was intercepted, nobody could do anything with it. Now, one of the things that over the last 30 years, that the advent of technology and the internet, and sort of our shift to the digital and now what we call this cyber age, you have to consider a whole lot more these days than just simply the communication of the traffic, because we plugged our networks and our operations into this global backbone, and now we have to protect that. And it used to be that the most valuable data, we would tell people to keep it in the innermost bowels of their network, layers and layers and layers away from the internet, from the fringe, because that's where all the bad guys were coming from. But we don't even do that anymore. Our backbone now is in the cloud, and it's somebody else's network and somebody else's infrastructure. And we don't even have physical devices like firewalls anymore. We have security as software, and we don't have administrators anymore. So there's lots changing, and the roles are changing, and certainly cybersecurity, most people think of it's a technical role, but I would suggest that in the broad spectrum of cybersecurity, there's a whole lot of things to do discipline wise that allows it always kind of is related to technology at this point. But I think there's an argument to be made for just about any role in a company could be considered a cybersecurity role. Or if you want to think about it, and I've given talks in the past about this, I think there's a distinction that we don't make very often where, and again, I'm old, so I'm thinking more of the traditional network structures where you have administrators, you have developers, you have DBAs and things like that. And there's people that are responsible for the network. There's people that are responsible for the desktops. There's people responsible for the servers, and so on and so forth. Obviously, to do their job well and to keep their whatever it is they're protecting secure, there's a lot of stuff that's involved in that. But I kind of think that's not purely a cybersecurity role, because they're first and foremost admins, developers, administrators, but security is certainly part of their job. And I think that's different from, say, the security organization in an organization, which typically they're doing the monitoring, they're doing the detecting. Obviously, there's automation, there's technology, there's reliance on all those other people. But if I was going to make a distinction, I would say just about everybody in an organization, whether it's the technical aspect or the business aspect or sales or marketing or whatever, they have a role to play in security. And so there's things that should be part of their job that are security related. And to that degree, they need to know about security. But the pure cybersecurity roles that strictly security, I think, is mostly anything related to monitoring, detection, and response. That's my opinion. Feel free to push back or move on and ask me another one of your questions.
No, I think that's great. No, it's more of a, and it's a conversation I have a lot with my customers. They go, "We're going to wheel in the security guy, right?" Kind of thing,
Right.
because they're going to ask this, and I go, "Whoa, Mr. Developer or Mrs. Developer, what are you doing to secure your code, right?" And then I go and speak to the DBA, and I go, and the same, right? If you need executive sponsorship, right, or just the end user, what is it you're doing, right? Because you need everybody to turn the key slightly to lock the door, right? That's the way I sort of, the analogy I use, right? Because it's in layers constantly, and
yeah, and
difficult.
I don't know what the origin is, but there's certainly a mentality in society, and most of the companies I go to, like the one you're describing, there's this presumption that security is somebody else's job. Security is done for
Correct.
you, and you don't have to do anything. And as somebody that came out of an organization that used to specialize in information cybersecurity, because that's all we did back then, and came out into the private sector for the purpose of trying to educate the masses and trying to bring that level of security out into to the real world and apply it appropriately. It's never stuck, and I think there's blame all around. We that came out didn't do a good job, but also the masses. They didn't understand it. They didn't want to. Very quickly, they bought into the idea of let's find technology solutions to do everything for us, or even if it's the tools that group of people that are responsible for doing it. And what never really translated well was the culture, building a culture of everybody in the company, no matter what their role is, has security in mind, has some idea of what is it that we have to protect, that deserves protection to stay in business, whether it's secrets or just operations or whatever. And instilling in them things that they should or should not do, and how that impacts the overall security objectives or security goal or security posture. People over the years, I try to have that conversation with dozens, if not hundreds, of clients that are like, yeah. Just tell us what we need to buy. How many blinky boxes? What colors should the lights be? Don't make us think about this. Just tell us what to do, and so we can automate it and make it all go away.
Yeah, it's more like, what do I need to pay, right, to fix the solution, rather than let's think this out, right, kind of thing. So
yep, absolutely.
Isn't it the same with DevOps, right? Everybody thinks that you can buy DevOps off a shelf, right? Like, oh, give me 2 times DevOps, right? Or give me 2 times information security,
whatever,
digital
right?
security, cybersecurity, whatever, right? And
yeah, cybersecurity is not a pill you take twice a day, before or after your meal. Although I do try to tell people that, also to try to clarify, cybersecurity is not this state. People talk about security. I'm a security professional. Security is not a state that you achieve. Okay, we're impermeable. The walls are high enough. The moat is deep enough. There's enough layers of protection. Nothing will ever happen. That ship sailed a long time ago, if it ever existed in any point in history. But security is something you do. It's a lifestyle. It's an ongoing activity, and it's processes more than anything. Yeah, there's tools, and yeah, there's automation, and yeah, there's people involved, but it all revolves around, in my opinion, and I've been doing this for years, but it's only been in the last year or two where I, was comfortable enough to say, in the triad that people describe security, data, at least data security, as being a combination of technology, people, and processes. I've landed on the processes. The industry props up the technology aspect, and that's 90% of our industry. We give lip service to people, and everybody says, yeah, they're the weakest link, and they're the ones that are always going to get you. Not a whole lot of people that talk about and focus on the process, and I kind of think it begins and ends with processes, and that's based on my 40 years of experience.
It's a very good call. I completely agree.
You don't have to agree, but think it.
No,
at least
no,
think,
it's not.
at least think about it.
All I think about, right, is when I was in the military, right? It was a signals organization, right? So
Right.
drills, processes, the stuff you were mentioning, right? Like we'd have crypto stores, right? We'd bury that stuff in the dirt, kind of thing, right? It's far away from people. And it was all processes. And I was young at the time. I was just doing as I was told, right? But like, it was enforced, right? So it's a different world, right? From, civilian life and everything else. But it's right. It's processes, right? And it was all put in place at every level, from the point you turn up to the edge of the base to try and get in, right, to what you did on a day-to-day basis, right? So I agree with that, to be quite honest.
Well, and when I was young, I was a civilian working for a military organization, and I immediately questioned all the processes, and
of course,
that's kind of silly. Why do I have to make sure? And of course, my first experience at security was committing a violation because I left a safe unlocked one night. But I literally said, "What's the big deal? The safe is in a locked room."
Oh, wow.
In a locked, guarded building that has a perimeter fence with concertina wire on it and people with guns. And I was young and naive, and I didn't get it, but I understood it after after it was drilled into me. That was my naivete of youth.
It's interesting
So,
because I'm always like, oh, there we got the security people again with their endless Excel sheets and stuff with things that we need to comply with and all these things, right? And I always joke and say, yeah, just unplug it and we're safe, right? Nobody can use it. So then at least we know for certain that nobody's breaching it or abusing it or whatever.
Right.
But then
until somebody comes along and plugs it back in. But.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but I'm always like, oh, okay, fine. But I'm changing my mindset a little bit. Okay, I prefer to have them be my conscience. Like, okay, I work in a platform team. I'm enabling like developers and stuff, and to make use of the cloud in a good way. And yesterday I was working with some Kubernetes policies and making sure that we're doing the right thing. And we're like, oh, really? We need to change this, right? And then you realize, okay, it's a layered approach. Somebody was pointing out to me that we're not secure enough. I'm like, okay, good point. Let's work on it, right? And then we have other items that we need to work on again. But it's always like, oh, really? Leave me alone. Yeah, you need a separate ID to do this, and you need a separate ID to that. And I'm like, okay, you want me to log in, log out, and all that stuff. But then it boils down to processes again. Like, okay, why are these things in place? And it's not to annoy me or to annoy anyone else. It's more like, okay, we need to make sure that we have the fundamental things, and like segregation of duties, all that kind of things implemented.
Yeah. And there's a lot of organizations that kind of give lip service to it. I would be remiss if I didn't say at some point that I am a QSA, a qualified security assessor, working in the payment card industry, PCI, and I've been doing that for almost 20 years, and I am known in some circles as the PCI guy. On our show, Paul's Security Weekly, not to do the shameless plug, but if I say PCI, everybody has to drink. So it's kind of a parlor game. But after so many years, more often than not, somebody else is bringing up PCI and bringing up the PCI question. Not that PCI is the be all end all, but it has been around almost 20 years, and it's based on foundational framework principles of information security that I believe don't change and haven't changed. What's changed is the technology and the way we do things. So there's a requirement for PCI that says have a firewall. Well, nobody has firewalls anymore. They have code written into their Kubernetes to protect their Kubernetes or their, I'm not very cloud conversant, but I know, because I've had to review them, the security rules, and which I find fascinating, because now it's no longer somebody that's well-versed in networking and traditional networking and understands the principles of firewalls. It's a developer that knows he has to write a couple more lines of code and may or may not know what it's doing. One of the fascinating conversations I had a couple years ago with someone that I met, at one or several security conferences I went to, was someone that was younger, Kubernetes expert at breaking Kubernetes and the cybersecurity aspect of Kubernetes. And we had a several hour discussion talking about using PCI as sort of the framework. Are the traditional security rules that PCI represents still applicable in a cloud virtualized Kubernetes type of environment? And we more or less concluded, the rules still apply. They're just implemented a whole lot differently. And there's some things that kind of go away, kind of don't make sense. But the principle that the original rule came about for usually is still there. It's just maybe done a little bit differently. So what's really needed then these days, and maybe this is a role for cybersecurity, is somebody that has the history and the context and the knowledge of the goals of cybersecurity and knows how to apply it to the ever-changing, ever-evolving, fast-moving, data-rich environments that we're creating in the modern digital world.
Yeah, so it's like the same principles apply, but we're just evolving, right? The framework, because, like you said, like PCI's evolved from whenever it was first, brought to market, right, or set as a standard, to the way that we apply it to technology today, right? It's still the same fundamentals, but things change, right, around the edges.
Yeah, I mean, it's some argue it hasn't changed enough, but it's usually people that think, well, there's nothing here telling me how to, secure my Kubernetes or secure my, my environment in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud or wherever. But one of the big things that's misunderstood about PCI is people think that PCI is granular, like a NIST 800 series or a CIS benchmark. PCI is rather non-specific in the sense that they say, secure your systems and do it in a way that's industry accepted using something like a NIST framework or a CIS benchmark or something like that. But pick one. We're not going to tell you what to do. We're just telling you to do it and make sure it's done well. So I have arguments with people about whether PCI is overly prescriptive or not prescriptive enough. And if anything, what I do these days is try to, teach the security principles, the fundamentals, and sort of debunk the misconceptions and the myths that have evolved around frameworks like PCI, probably again started by sales and marketing groups, not to pick them up. Because you got to have something to sell your new widget, your new tool, your new solution.
I love what you just highlighted, Jeff. That the fundamentals, right? I always try to, whenever I can, to plug the fundamental knowledge, and it's from CPU to all the way to networking and storage and just the fundamental concepts, because everybody just steps over them and wants to work on something that they think is more interesting. Yeah, let's do Kubernetes to reuse the Kubernetes example, and then you're like, yeah, okay, but have you already looked at networking, right? Because 60% is networking, and there's this meme. Probably you guys know them, but then you see cybersecurity on a couple of steps on the stairs, right? And then somebody steps over like fundamental things, and then they just want to go to cybersecurity in this case.
Right.
So that, yeah, I wanted to
Yeah.
replug it.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many tangents we could go off on here. Ask me another question.
Yeah.
So I actually wanted to, because we also do this show, right, for people that are early in careers, right, or maybe they're in a
Mhm.
career that they're not, they want to try something else.
Right.
So everyone's journey is different. Everybody's route
Mhm.
is different, right? And I want to make that
Right.
clear to people because they always think, right, if I read this book or I follow this process, then I'm going to eventually end up in this role, right? But
Right.
actually, things happen, right? So
Right.
if we wind the clock back to when you were leaving high school, right, and
Mhm.
you went to university or college, and then you started applying for roles, how
Right.
did that happen that you ended up working at the NSA, right? Because for me, like if I left college, I'd be like, well, I'm not going to apply for the NSA, right? That one, would they take me on, right? Kind of thing, or
Right.
two, have I got what it takes, right? So, some folks go to the private sector, some folks go to the public sector, right? So, if we could just talk a
Right.
little bit about that.
Yeah, because we did promise that I would tell stories. So I'll try to do as best as I can. Now, it's an interesting question because on our podcast, when we interview somebody, we always ask them, how'd you get your start in cybersecurity? And if anybody in the last couple of years would ask me that question, I generally said, well, I worked at NSA, because I sort of jumped to that being, everybody's like, oh, NSA, that's, immediately, the, uh, I have credibility because of that. Whether it's deserved or not, that's another question. Um, but the question you asked, how I got to NSA, is something I figured out in the last couple of years, and the most recent talk I've given at conferences has been exploring that because um, when I graduated high school, I didn't know NSA existed. I went off to college. Uh, Went through several majors, ended up being a business major with a concentration in human resource management, mostly because that was a major that was fairly easy to me, didn't have to do as much work, and I avoided in my entire academic career ever taking a physics class. My dad was a physicist, and
Right.
I might have a daddy issue or two. Um, but I graduated college, and as I mentioned earlier, I went to work for a naval facility. I'd actually gotten a summer job. My mom was in HR at this naval facility, and she got me
Right.
a
Okay.
lined up a summer intern type of job between my junior and senior year. And because I was a relative, I wasn't technically an intern. I was a temporary hire, and so they could just put me on leave without pay, and I was able to come back over the holidays and work a week or so and earn a little, spending money. And then when I graduated, they let me come back. I was working in the technical library. I was a clerk typist. I was a GS3, which means I didn't make a whole lot of money. And I was just kind of bopping around trying to figure out what I wanted to do. She, being in HR, got wind somewhere along the line that NSA was hiring, and I had never heard of NSA. NSA back in those days was a very clandestine, super secret type of organization, and nobody that worked at NSA would acknowledge that they worked at NSA. But so I filled out an application. What NSA was mostly doing in those days, which is the point I want to get to, that I think is more relevant to the question you're asking. This was during the Cold War. This is the Reagan administration, where the U.S. was outspending the Soviet Union. I mean, we won the Cold War basically because we bankrupted them, because we outspent them. I NSA was going around to universities throughout the country and looking for what they called critical skills, which were either computer scientists, engineers, or mathematicians. They considered them critical skills. They would talk to people majoring in that field and say, "Hey, if you come work for us, we'll pay for you to go to get your graduate, master's degree. We'll give you all the best opportunities. It's a cool place to
Right.
work." A lot of people took them up on it. I have a buddy from high school that went that route. He was recruited out of college, university. Um, I filled out an application and mailed it in. and waited several weeks and got a mailed response inviting me to go to Fort Meade in Maryland, which is where NSA is located. And I was there for 2 or 3 days. They gave me a battery of all sorts of different types of aptitude tests and skills tests. And I would love to see a list of all the different things. I only remember several of them. One of them was, and again, this was signals intelligence. This is traffic analysis. This is intercepting communications out of the air type of thing. So one test was a whole big list of collection traffic, communication traffic, and it was all encrypted. It was all garbled, and they had all sorts of questions just trying to figure out if you could figure out organizational structure, command structure, who's the headquarters, who are the deployed troops, and stuff like that. What we call traffic analysis. One test, which was my favorite, was they showed you a line drawing of a two-dimensional drawing of a three-dimensional object, and they asked you, what does this look like from behind? What does this object look like from below? Just a series of tests like that. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. This is easy. So I filled it out and picked the right response, but apparently not everybody can do that. There was another test that they had artificial language, again, communications traffic intercepted, only this time not encrypted, but it was gibberish. It wasn't a real language, but you were trying to figure out, could you pick out parts of speech? Could you figure out what the verbs were? Could you figure out what the nouns were? Could you derive names from objects and things like that? Yeah. A lot of patterns. So I took that series of tests. I scored really well on them, and they offered me a job. So I went to work for NSA, but I didn't actually have an assignment. While I was waiting to get my background investigation so I could get a top secret clearance, I basically went around different organizations with NSA, going on job interviews, which were more sales pitches. You want to come to work for us? It was a weird thing, but they hired me because of my grades. Not because of my grades, because of my scores on these tests. But they didn't have any particular place to put me.
Right. Okay.
Now, where it becomes interesting is I ended up working on the information security side in what was known the manual cryptosystems branch. So I was working with traditional old-fashioned ciphers and ultimately what's called a one-time pad, but a lot of paper product. And it was used very commonly back in those days for various people on the U.S. side talking to various people maybe that had been recruited, let's say, from other countries and so on and so forth.
Operators, right?
Secret writings and the one-time pad that the people would use would be printed about yay big so that it could be hidden in the heel of a shoe type of thing. Because if they got discovered with a one-time pad, they would no longer be around. That's how the Soviet Union worked. I ended up there. I had a mentor that was a cryptanalyst from the operations side of the house. He'd been there 15, 20 years or so, breaking the codes, breaking the ciphers from all over the world. But he had done a diversity tour over to this office because this was mid 80s, where because of the advent of computers, teletype machines, we called them more commonly word processors back in those days. But also the beginnings of more and more machine cryptography, machine-based. Everybody knows about the Enigma machine from World War II, but stuff like that. But into the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was more and more. NSA was building little black boxes that had all sorts of mechanical, electronic type of stuff. Not quite the digital age yet. The paper side of things was assumed to be going away, so it had kind of been neglected. So I was hired to do evaluations, from a cryptanalytic perspective on the strength and the robustness of all the different paper systems and manual systems that were currently being used by our allies, our troops, and our forces. What I find interesting is growing up. I mentioned my dad was a physicist, so he was kind of analytical. I'm the youngest of four boys. We were all a little musically inclined. We were all um, sort of analytical problem solvers. I remember when I was a kid, when we used to go to the beach, uh, my dad would buy a puzzle magazine, a Dell crossword puzzle magazine that had not just crossword puzzles, but all sorts of different kinds of puzzles. And, my brothers and I, we would pick our favorite types of puzzles to do, but everybody loved there was one, sometimes a bonus two logic problem that was in these magazines, and these logic problems were maybe 5 or 6 or 7 statements that would be, you know. Let's say it's a school, and they're talking about 5 different teachers, and each teacher has a classroom that has a name or a number or a color, and they've got a student that's their best student or something like that. So it was usually, 3 or 4 or 5 sets of things that were usually 4 or 5 or 6 variables, and the problem was to try to, whose class, what's the name of the teacher, what's their student, what's the color of the wall, type of thing, based on very simple statements like Billy is not in Joey's class, which is yellow, and you'd have to try to figure it out
Right.
from that. So one of the ironies, looking back on it now after all these years, is this guy that was a cryptanalyst that was my mentor initially, teaching not only cryptology but kind of how to work, work the bureaucracy, because NSA is, after all, a government agency. I found out at some point that as a side job, he wrote logic problems for Dell magazine. Dell Crossword Puzzle magazine. So, like, when I found that out, I'm like, I'm in the right place. But what I've given a talk about recently is looking back on that and realizing, I was not a critical skill. I was not a mathematician. I was not an engineer. I was not a computer scientist. But NSA had this series of tests that were able to find, my aptitude, my potential with a lot of different things. And I don't even know what all they are necessarily, but they found me and were able to hire me. And I did, in the 10 years I was there, I did some pretty significant things, first time type of things. And many of the people that I knew that were the critical skill, the ones that got paid more and got first in line for promotions and all the advanced degrees and all that kind of stuff, had it all paid for them. They did that for 2 or 3 years and went out into the private sector and were gone. So, I've always had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that, but B, more recently, I'm fascinated in trying to discover how, what is it about NSA and their process of basically how did they find me? And I think that's something that I am trying to figure out how to pursue in our cybersecurity world of, these days it's STEM. Everybody's STEM, 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 or you have to have this certification that requires a certain level of experience, but they're looking for you to have that certification. I'm not going to name it. Basically, as entry level position. I would love for more people to figure out how to find the people that, I'm not saying those things aren't important, and I certainly don't think, I certainly think those types of skills are necessary, but they're not the only things that are necessary.
Yeah, sure.
There's other skills and capabilities and tendencies and disciplines and talents even that are out there that don't kind of fit neatly into that little box of STEM. And I would love, yeah, and I think different people do it to different degrees. They have an idea, but I would love to see it a little bit more systematic and a little bit more programmatic and more, well known, so that somebody that may not be one of those, specific skill sets or have that degree or background still might be qualified, especially like we said earlier, because there's so many different kinds of jobs that are sort of under this umbrella of cybersecurity. I mean, you need to have people that can look at data, that like to analyze data. Maybe those are accountants. I've heard stories in the last couple of years, especially people losing their job during COVID and trying to retrain themselves. I met somebody in the recent past that had hired several people that used to be chefs, but the restaurant closed because they were and so they had to find work. And they said, I think they had hired two different people that had been chefs or sous chefs, and they said they're amazing because there's so much attention to detail that there's a formula, there's a menu, but there's also that ability to, add a little pinch of this, add a little pinch of that, sort of follow the script, but also be creative and somehow that lends to whatever. I think it's some sort of a monitoring sock roll or something that they were doing initially. There's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of things out there that could be done like that if we only knew what they were. Which is not to disparage people that are already in those disciplines, as I said, but since we supposedly have a shortage and we need to find people, I think there's a whole lot of people out there that could do the jobs and do them really well, but they're not qualified on paper the way we're traditionally looking for. So we need to find ways to finding them, and if your audience are those people, we need to help them figure out how to stand out and be recognized and given a chance and more than likely flourish and be very successful.
That for me echoes very true. So you said you took those tests, right? I had to take a similar test.
I mean, it's apparently like a military thing because I've heard other people.
It is. It's just like general, right? It's like a cutout, right? But I remember I'm not very well at the time. I wasn't very academic, right? It's just the way my brain's wired, right?
Right.
And I did the test, and it didn't go well, right? But then I remember the sergeant coming in, and he went, "We've heard that you can do this stuff." So he took me to another room, right? And he went, "Do this. Wire this radio." I can't remember what it was. And I did it, and he passed me through. And I think that's what you're trying to say is like, well, I want to see your mindset, right? I just want to see your abilities rather than, well, you didn't go to university, right? You haven't got the piece of paper. Well, okay, let's try this other route, right? Because there's all that talent out there that's untapped. And I think that's what you're trying to get at, right? Is how do we encourage it and flourish, right? Make it flourish. And people don't, like you said, he hired those chefs, right? In that example. I mean, I had a scenario a few months back, and we had a new starter, and she went, "Yeah, I used to be a vet, right? Like a veterinary doctor kind of thing. And now I work in tech." And I was like, she was like, "I don't know why I'm here," kind of thing, right? I'm quite shocked by it all. But there were skills that were transferable, right? So yeah, I agree with you. It's how do we figure that out? And that's what we've been trying to do, right, Robin, is the folks that haven't gone down that route, because there are other ways. There is different avenues, but again, with cybersecurity, most folks think that you need a degree, right? Or information security, you need a degree. But actually, you could start off as a network engineer, right? Or you could start off as a
or not. I mean, again, you're
not
still
right, or whatever.
You're still listing the paradigm that everybody goes with. Maybe you're a secretary, if that's even a term we use these days. Maybe you're a short order chef. Maybe you cut lawns, but you're also a musician. It seems to be a lot of people in the however the brain works. People that are musical. At least from an NSA perspective, tend to be good at the things that NSA does. I mean, looking back on it, they were finding the skills and the potential, and I scored well on the test. It made me a good cryptanalyst, and the key word being analyst. I was a cryptanalyst. I was an information security analyst, but it's all analyst, problem solving, puzzle solving. Musical. I'm left-handed. I think there's a more preponderance of left-handed people in our field than any other field. There's certainly a lot of people, myself included, that are a little bit geeky, nerdy, OCD, ADHD, somewhere on the spectrum, but really do well at the things that we do. There's an seemingly endless list. NSA, I learned later, NSA liked to hire people that had liberal arts degrees that came from liberal arts disciplines, so where you got a broad spectrum of your education. Um, and I happen to have a liberal arts degree. So just, I tried to put some of my characteristics out to see if they resonate with other people, because I think we're all a lot more alike than not. And what I like to tell people that, like your audience, people that are listening, people that are considering careers in cybersecurity or want to grow their career in cybersecurity, um, other than the fact that you need a job and need a paycheck, ideally, and I would say this for any field or discipline really, but especially in our field, whatever you can do, try to get exposed to as many different things as possible, because there are so
For
many
sure.
aspects to
Yeah.
cybersecurity. At a lot of the hacker conferences, we sort of elevate the pen tester and the one that does the hacking, and whether hacking is a good term or not. But there's so many other responsibilities and disciplines and things to do out there, but everybody wants to be a pen tester. And since that's kind of my origin story, they come up, I want to be like you. I want to be a pen tester. I'm like, well, slow down. There's other things to do, but try everything. Um, Find out what you like. I mean, I'm not into number crunching, but there's other people that are fascinated by it. Data science is, a burgeoning discipline within this field. And it's sort of, not to use a marketing term, it's sort of greenfield. There's a lot of places you can go with data science and data analysis. And I think we're still just scratching the surface of that. But find something you like, find something you enjoy, find something aspect of this that piques your interest, and also be looking for something that maybe you feel like, I'm kind of good at this. I think I can kind of do this. I have the potential or the aptitude. If you're extremely lucky, what you like to do and what you're good at doing will be the same thing, and then your path. The trick, of course, is getting those types of opportunities, and that can sometimes be difficult. There's education. There was no degrees when I was growing up in this. They didn't exist, so that certainly was not an option that I did. There's training. That seems appropriate. Experience is what everybody wants you to have. So it's really, how do you get the experience? Certifications, they've become a stepping stone, a roadblock, a gatekeeping activity. But certifications aren't today what they were intended to be, because what they were originally intended to be was just some sort of empirical statistical evidence that you had the experience based on, there were no degrees back then, and so on and so forth. But they've become, I think, sort of surrogate training tools. I think if I pass this certification because I took a 4 or 8 hour course, or I read the review book, and I'm really good at taking tests, then I'm qualified to do the job. There's many of us in the industry that have very dim views of people with certain certifications, that got them because they took a test, and not because they had any kind of experience in the industry, which certification is supposed to reflect experience, in a statistical manner. If the old saying is, if you want a job, get experience. If you need experience, get a job. Um, how does that work these days? Look for volunteer opportunities, whatever job in whatever
Sure.
organization you have. Ask if you can help out. Most people would love to dump the mundane, busy work, documentation stuff on you, especially within the pure cybersecurity organization. Even just ask if you can look over the shoulder, ask questions what people are doing, expose yourself to as much as possible. Even talk to the marketing people and the sales people. They need people that know what this stuff's all about too. That's important too, and that's legitimate too. But you sort of have to put yourself out there, and a lot of us aren't like that. A lot of us aren't people comfortable talking to people or looking people in the eyes, so it can be hard. But you got to put yourself out there, look for opportunities, dabble. Um, meetups as they're coming back again. There's usually meetups in the town where you live. Just be inquisitive and curious. I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's what I did more than anything, especially in my early days of NSA. As I was learning the processes, I walked around from desk to desk and person to person and said, "Hi, what do you do? What are you responsible for? How does it all fit together?" Because I think ultimately I love doing puzzles. I love solving puzzles. And so I treat everything in this business as a puzzle where there's a solution and an answer. And there can be multiple answers, but there's an answer out there. I know our time is running short, but I would be remiss if I did not mention one of the people that was an important person in my career at NSA. Gentleman named Brian Snow, who you may or may not have ever heard of, but he was chief scientist when I was at the beginning of my career at NSA. And I quote him often, although I don't name the source, but he told me very early on, and it probably wasn't his original quote, but that's who I heard it from. What is created by man can be broken by man. And that is a mantra that was sort of ingrained into us at NSA, especially on the defensive side, as we were trying to create systems that we thought couldn't be broken by the adversary. It was very humbling, and I think it's very true, especially in today's world. All the solutions we have out there, all the technologies that we have out there to try to defeat the bad guy from stealing our data and doing bad things to us. And then we find out that there's this huge hole in it, or a huge workaround, or a huge way to avoid it altogether. That phrase is always echoed in my head. And he got Alzheimer's a few years ago, which was tragic because he was a brilliant mind, but inspirational to my career. So I just wanted to mention Brian Snow, former NSA, who passed away just this week. So in remembrance to Brian.
Very, very sorry to hear that. And I've experienced Alzheimer's as well. And it's a difficult journey.
Yeah.
And not just for the person having it, right, who's going through it, but obviously the people around them as well. And like you said, if he was a brilliant mind, right, and he was a mentor and everything else, it's difficult. So we pass on our condolences.
Yeah, a huge loss to our industry, whether we know it or not. Unfortunately,
for sure. Okay. So right, well, I think we're about time. I think I just want to pick up on Jeff has got a podcast show, right? That's been going for how many years now, Jeff?
It's about 16 years.
16 years, right? So that's, I mean,
I've only been involved with it for about 8 years, so roughly half.
8 years, right. But 16 years is still an achievement. Do you want to give us some details about it and where folks can find it, right?
Sure. The show is called Paul's Security Weekly, and it's the flagship show of a series of podcasts. You can find them at securityweekly.com. We have Paul's Security Weekly, which is originally just a couple guys getting together in their garage or basement and having drinks and cigars and talking about all the good and bad and ugly of the security industry, the latest news, the latest hacks and vulnerabilities and things like that. There's other shows that are more tailored to specific audiences. We have one that's Application Security Weekly. You kind of guess what the focus is of that. Enterprise Security Weekly, how to implement programs to the enterprise world. Business Security Weekly, which is more tailored to smaller companies and startups. I actually used to have a show. It's on hiatus. That was Security and Compliance Weekly. How do you bridge the gap between the people that are like security and compliance are two different things and they're totally unrelated? Well, guess what? They are related. So we were trying to tear down the silos and bridge the gaps with our show. We do I think it's twice weekly segment that's just security news of the week. And there's a couple other shows that are on hiatus. One show that's for beginners and things like that. But you can find it all at securityweekly.com or look for securityweekly.com. We're on YouTube. We're on Twitch. We're on all the different podcast catchers. The original show's been around for 16 years, so we have a pretty huge international following, and we're corporately owned now. I would be remiss if I did not say we're now part of Cyber Risk Alliance. So we're in the process of rebranding everything, but we're still Paul Security Weekly, and it's still run by Paul Passadorian.
Awesome. I like the idea of the beginners one, right? If that ever reactivates, I mean, that's a good place for people to start as well, right? So,
well, I mean, although it's on hiatus, there's still an archive of all the episodes. It's called Secure Digital Life.
Awesome.
So, all of our shows are recorded and are available, and we're working on ways of searching through them. I mean, we ourselves as co-hosts, weren't we talking to a guy about this like 6 months, 9 months, 3 years ago? What episode was that? So sometimes we want to bring up the old episodes because somebody else was just saying the same thing. We want to tie it all together. We're working on it. It's an ever evolving process is you're learning on the fly, right?
Always.
Yeah. Still trying to get that introduction sorted, right?
Yeah, and you need theme music. You gotta ease into it with the theme music.
Yeah, we were bouncing off some ideas.
We
were bouncing off some ideas to create something, but we'll like the constructive feedback. So feedback's always welcome. So thank you for that.
Well, I don't know if I've successfully defended or represented cybersecurity the way you wanted, but to me, it's information security, but call it cyber if you will.
No, for sure. I always like to think the more information we can give folks and the more perspective, right, then they can navigate this, because it's, even I still, when I look at it, I'm like, wow, it's huge, right? So finding the right discipline, the right role, or something that you're interested in, the more information you've got, right, the better. So again, thanks again, Jeff, for being on the show. It's been great. I mean, you've got an amazing career, right? And we're sure to see you again. Again, if you like to see what we're producing, the content we're developing, don't forget to like and subscribe on the show. And we'll catch you on the next one.
All right. Thanks for having me, guys. Pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And don't remember, guys, don't be a stranger. Take care.
Don't be a stranger. Bye.
Bye-bye.